Hi, guys. I'm so happy and thrilled to be hosting the next session. And this session is called Beyond Knowledge, How Technology is Driving an Age of Consciousness. My name is Pareesh Chaudhary, and the person who's going to be presenting this is Professor William Halal. Professor Halal is the emeritus at the George Washington University with degrees from Purdue, UC Berkeley. Professor Halal has published 7 books and hundreds of articles, consults to corporations and government, and is a frequent speaker like today, once substituting for Peter Drucker. I would now pass on the floor to Professor Halal. And this, by the way, profile doesn't really cut it. I mean, his work is absolutely tremendous in the field of technology and consciousness. Professor Halal, over to you.
Thank you, Pravesh. That's very kind of you. Let me get my presentation up. Just give me a second here. Okay. Well, this is the title here is the title of my new book, and as it shows, my studies here show that we are living beyond knowledge now, and I'm going to show you how that means this is the beginning of an age of consciousness, is driven by the digital revolution, and I think this offers a hopeful perspective on where the world is now and where it's going. Contrary to the gloom that is everywhere. Everybody I talk to thinks the world is coming to an end, but that's not true. If you look at the evidence, I will show you that the world is moving towards an age of consciousness, and that's going to produce a global consciousness soon, maybe this decade. Now, I know that's hard to believe, but I'm going to show you the evidence showing that that's true. Now, here's an overview of what I'm going to talk about. Let me say something about the image on the right. That's the cover of my new book. And it shows this young woman is a goddess, a modern goddess, and she is giving humanity the vision for a sustainable world. And all of these concepts are the content of the book. And she's also she's a woman explicitly because the feminine qualities of cooperation and wisdom and even love are necessary to create this world. And she's also young because the young generation has the responsibility for making this happen. Now, here are the key concepts I'm going to discuss. I'm going to first explain why we're moving beyond knowledge and into an age of consciousness. And then I'm going to show you an accurate depiction of the history of evolution of civilization. This is accurate. You're going to see it's a breakthrough in the study of social evolution. And then we're going to say a bit about the crisis of global maturity that is blocking the path. We all know about that. And how this is going to lead to a mental spiritual revolution soon, not in the distant future, soon, maybe this decade, and then global consciousness. And if we have time, I'll talk about the next 2 bullets.
Professor Halal, did you share
Yes.
the screen? Because I'm not really, I don't see the screen.
Oh, you don't? Oh, my God.
No.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Let me go back. Hold on. Oh, sorry. Oh, you're right. I forgot to share screen. Okay, sorry.
That's all right. I mean, I started to wonder, like, where's the goddess? I don't see the goddess, and maybe,
Well, you've got to enable me to share the screen. You've got to go to participants. Go to participants. Click on the little arrow. Alethea, can you help? Are you there? Let's see. Maybe I can do it. No, I can't do it.
Okay, so I click
participants. Click on a little arrow, and then enable screen host. Make me a co-host.
Got it. So I've made you
co-host.
The host for this. Okay, so you're the host for this.
Okay. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. Let me go back here. Oh, Okay. Well, I'm not going to go over this again. And this is, I just talked about this. The cover is this goddess giving humanity the vision for a global consciousness. And I'm not going to go over this again. These are the key concepts I'm going to cover. Let's move on. Now, here's what I mean by moving beyond knowledge to consciousness. The triangle shows all of the elements, the cognitive functions that make up consciousness. And it comprises of two different types of consciousness: the objective functions, which are the routine stuff, perception, learning, knowledge. And then beyond that are the subjective functions: emotion, purpose, values, beliefs, and so forth. The interesting thing that's happening is that AI and the digital revolution is automating the objective functions. Those are disappearing because they are automated by AI. The first bullet, for instance, makes that clear. We now have 16 billion PCs, smartphones, and laptops for 8 billion people in the world, so there's no shortage of knowledge. That's 2 computers per person on average. And AI is automating knowledge, and beyond knowledge is consciousness by definition. As you can see here in the triangle, everything beyond knowledge is subjective consciousness. And that's what I mean by consciousness, higher order consciousness. And the last bullet illustrates the problem that we have today. The digital revolution has produced this explosion of social media, which I compare to the biblical tree of knowledge. Knowledge is dangerous, like the invention of the printing press 3 or 4 centuries ago unleashed a flood of nonsense and wars and the Protestant Reformation. And social media now is doing the same thing. Social media provokes emotion, controversy, disinformation, and all of this post-factual nonsense that we are preoccupied with today. So this is what's happening right now. We are now living beyond knowledge. That's my main point. We're in the early stages of an age of consciousness. Now, here's I'm going to eliminate this image here. Give me a second. Okay. Now, this is what the life cycle of evolution. You can find little sketches like this commonly, but this is an accurate graph that shows the evolution of civilization from the very beginning to the present stage. And it's, as I say, this is real. It has real scales and real data. The thing that makes it work is the logarithmic scale at the bottom. If this were not a logarithmic scale, you wouldn't see anything. It would be a flat line, and then it would make a sharp turn upward. But with a log scale, it stretches out the present so you can see what's happening. And the vertical scale, of course, is simply the very stages of civilization's progress, the very stages of evolution. All of these data points are well established. This is accurate data. The critical point, if you can see my cursor, is right here, 2020. This is when I think we reached the saturation point, the crisis of maturity, when we first started entering an age of consciousness. And I think it happened 2020 because that's when the subjective consciousness reached a critical point. This was when, in the US, we had an insurrection of the federal government. It never happened before. It demonstrated how crazy this post-factual stuff had become. And I think I consider that the beginning of the age of consciousness, when the subjective stuff became dominant. And all of these stages of social evolution have been propelled by revolutions: the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, the post-industrial revolution that introduced the service age, and the information revolution. And if that holds, we are likely to see a mental spiritual revolution, and I estimate it to happen about 2025, plus or minus 5 years. Now, I know that sounds bold, but I'm going to show you that I think this is likely to happen. The evidence, I think, makes this a compelling case, and it changes everything. This is also hopeful. There is so much gloom out there today. People think it's the end of the world. And I don't think that makes sense. It's a terrible way to see the future as nonsensical. This makes sense of the future. It shows us that a hopeful future is possible. And I think it's likely. Okay, let me move on. Now, here's a quick summary of what I call the crisis of global maturity. This is something that Michael and Mary and I did a few years ago, but I think it's even more acute now. We found all these trends driving the crisis and very few resolving it. And we did a survey that shows that most people think we're heading for disaster or a catastrophe. You can ask people off the street and they will agree. The pandemic, for instance, made that clear. People think the system doesn't work. And the reason is that lack of leadership, political will, vision, and so forth. So this is the problem that we are struggling with today. My next slide shows why I think we're likely to see a mental spiritual revolution. The figure here is the Renaissance, and what it shows what we need is a new Renaissance, a new enlightenment. As I've said, all stages of evolution are driven by revolutions. The present world order is not sustainable. And the World Economic Forum, for instance, a year or two ago came out and said that they think we need a global reset in all spheres of society. And The Guardian just published an article pointing out that a survey of thousands of people shows that 2/3 of people in modern nations think that we need a major reform in the political, economic, and healthcare systems. So the need for change is here now. Consciousness, as I've said, I think it implies maturity. Consciousness is the last stage in the life cycle of evolution. So it implies that the development of civilization is reaching a point of conclusion, of its culminating. A maturity, global maturity is needed. And it's comparable to a teenager reaching maturity. If you've experienced what happens to teenagers, they can't cope with the world. They don't have the consciousness of adults. And they suffer with this enormous pain until the pain reaches the point where they can't tolerate any longer and they finally make the adjustment to becoming adult. That's what the planet has to do now. We are struggling with nonsense, with a crisis that is unsustainable. People know the world doesn't work. And how much pain are we going to endure before we make a mental shift to a global consciousness? And we see here in the second last bullet, some trends that are moving in this direction. The Me Too movement, for instance, has made it clear that women no longer want to tolerate being harassed by men. This is happening around the world. The same is true of the Black Lives Matter movement. People of color around the world no longer will tolerate being discriminated against. And we've seen in the US a revolt of workers who no longer want to come into the office every day. They want to have a system where they can come into the office 2 or 3 days a week and work from home 2 or 3 days a week. And most importantly, business is becoming democratic. I know this sounds hard to believe, but it's happening. The Business Roundtable in the US recently announced that shareholders are no longer the only goal to be served, that all social interests are of equal importance. And if we do this properly, it will mean a collaborative business enterprise where managers work with employees, customers, and governments to determine the policies and goals of the corporation. And this would be good for everybody, including the business. Business could make more money while serving social needs. This is historic. It's never happened before. It's, I think, one of the best indicators that we're entering an age of consciousness. I'm not going to say anything about the last point. Let me move on. Now, here's what I mean by global consciousness. This is not utopian. It's not a fantasy. It's a vision of what is needed for a sustainable world. Just as any business knows that it needs to have a vision to pursue its goals. You have to start with a vision of what you want to achieve, and then you can do it. And that's what we need now for the world. We need a vision of where the world could end up being sustainable. These 5 principles are principles that we've developed at TechCast, working with our experts, and we've used these concepts with various groups, and people find this compelling. It makes good sense. I'm going to talk about them briefly. The first is treat the earth and all life forms as sacred. Now, this makes perfect sense, really. We know the environment is crucial to the future of this planet. And so we have to treat it as though it's sacred. Doesn't mean we can't use the environment for our purposes, but we have to do it with care and make sure the environment is intact and healthy. And the second, managing the world as a unified whole, does not mean global government or anything like that. It simply means that people, corporations and governments have to work together for their common good. It's simply enlightened self-interest. And this is what the pandemic made clear, that if we want to solve global problems like the pandemic, we have to see global cooperation. And thirdly, democracy and enterprise should be instilled through all corporations and all institutions. That's not the case now. The typical corporation is a autocratic hierarchy, and governments, for instance, are failing. Democracies are failing, which is why autocrats are gaining control over large parts of the world. And to solve the problem, we have to reinvent government. And the best thing that governments need is to solve the problems of bureaucracy, which means introducing enterprise, markets inside of government, like allowing parents to choose the schools that they want their children to attend, which holds schools accountable, provides choices, and so forth. This is, I think, a really crucial development to introduce democracy and enterprise throughout all institutions, and then embrace diversity as an asset. Diversity is not a problem. It's simply that we don't understand that people who are different have something to offer. They have more knowledge, they have different knowledge and different cultures that we can benefit from. And if we can embrace people who are different, we would all benefit. And finally, we have to celebrate global community. Any community has to celebrate its values, its beliefs, and its welfare together. Like the global Olympics, we need more of that. So those are the principles that we think something like this. It could turn out to be very different, of course. It could turn out to be some kind of global ethics or a collective epiphany or a new world order. But I think something like this is likely to happen this decade because the problem is so severe. Climate change, for instance, is getting worse. It's almost intolerable now, and it's going to get worse. And as we struggle with all of this pain, at some point, people are going to realize that we have to make a shift in mindset. Let me move to my next slide. Now, I'm just going to say something brief about this. In an age of consciousness, the big challenge is to manage our own minds because the world is complex, it's turbulent, and we have to struggle to maintain our equilibrium, to understand what we are thinking, and to become aware, to control ourselves. These are all methods that people have traditionally used to control their minds, but we don't think of it that way. But now we have to think of it that way. And so we have to think about ways, technologies of consciousness, to keep ourselves under control. And now my last slide is the transformation of institutions. We talked about this briefly. The business corporation becoming a collaborative enterprise or a democratic enterprise, governments in introducing entrepreneurship and markets, and so forth. So that I'm going to stop here. And I want to just make some final points before we take any questions that we may have. I know this asks a lot. It's a very different perspective. And I don't offer this out of wishful thinking or fantasy. This is supported by the evidence that I've just shown you. I think it makes a compelling case that the world is changing dramatically. We are now living beyond knowledge, and the world is a very difficult, confusing place because of all of this nonsense that's being promulgated through social media. The challenge the world faces is to make sense out of all this and to find a coherent philosophy that can unite us as a global consciousness. That's difficult, no question about it. But every system has to have a common set of beliefs if it's going to function effectively. And if we hope to have a sustainable globe, we have to have some kind of overarching belief system that makes sense, that everybody can adhere to. And I think this is a hopeful perspective, contrary to all of the doom and gloom that is around today. People don't believe that this is possible. But if you look at the evidence that I've shown here, I think it is possible, and I think it is likely. Let me stop here, and I'm going to turn off my screen share and see if we have any questions. Let me see here.
Thank you, Professor Halal. I'm going to just reclaim the host rights until we see any questions coming in.
I don't see any questions here. We don't have an audience.
Well, there's me. And, let me, there's me. You mentioned something about you in the beginning, you said that we need a new form of enlightenment. When
Yes.
When you say this, can you elaborate? How would that look like? And what is the tangible way of knowing what that could be?
Well, it's what I call global consciousness, Paresh. Global consciousness, something like that. Some basic overarching principles that everybody can adhere to because they are common sense and that they're necessary for a sustainable world. And I think we see the elements of that now, as I say, with the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, the Democratic Corporation, and so forth. So I think it's beginning now. But it's going to be very difficult. I don't want to minimize the challenge. It's enormous. But if we want to have a world that works, something like this has to happen. And I think it's likely soon because the pain is getting very severe. Why don't you ask some more questions, Paresh, if nobody else has questions?
I'll just have a lot of them because,
Yeah, go ahead.
When you mentioned that we need to move towards that sort of a world which could be relatively less painful. And so if the ideal situation is humans are supposed to suffer less, who is going to be driving that momentum?
That's hard to say. This is such a mysterious process. It's bigger than any of us. It's the life of the planet evolving, social evolution. I don't think we can know who's going to lead this. I am trying to provide some leadership with this concept and my book, and I think this makes good sense. I can't find any other way to make sense out of where we are in the world today. There's a lot of nonsense out there, but this is the only way that I can make sense out of where we are and where we're going. And I don't think we can tell how it's going to happen.
Okay. So Richard has, I think who's going to be speaking after you, has this question. So how do you think environment will fit into this new consciousness?
The environment?
Yeah.
You mean the physical environment, climate change?
Well, yes, exactly. I mean, Richard, that's what you meant, right? Yes.
Well, the environment is driving the change. The disaster of climate change is forcing us to make this change, and people are very aware of the dangers, and it's going to get worse. The environment, the climate change is not going to get better in the near future. The planet is so huge that it takes decades to turn it around. So we're going to see more pain from the environment, and it's going to force people to change our attitudes and hopefully to embrace something like a global consciousness. I see Carla's here. Maybe Carla has something she'd like to say. You're muted, Carla. Why don't you unmute yourself?
Yeah, William, thank you very much.
You're still muted.
Oh,
Okay, now go ahead. No, you're muted again. Who's muting you?
Wait. Are you, Carla? Are you gonna unmute yourself? Should I see if I could do it from here?
I don't have nothing to say yet,
now.
buddies. I don't have nothing to say yet.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Anyway, thank you, William.
Okay, Richard, do you have something you want to say?
William, no, thanks very much. I hope you stay for my talk because I think it interrelates very much with your talk, and I'm particularly interested in the interrelationship between the conversation that we might be having between humankind and the environment, but a proper conversation rather than us constantly interpreting what we think of the environment or making rules for environment. So I'm really interested in your talk over all things, and that's something to reflect on, but no further questions at this point. Thank you.
Well, I think you're right. I think the environment is a key player here. Futurists have worried about this for decades. You remember the limits to growth study, that was almost 50 years ago. And there were lots of concerns about the future of the planet. But we seem to muddle through until we reach this point where climate change is really getting severe. And so it can't be ignored any longer. The climate problems are deadly. And as I say, I think they're going to get worse. It's going to create enormous pressure for change. And soon, I think in the next few years. In fact, in the US, I think the year 2024 is going to be a moment of truth because Trump is probably going to run again to be reelected as president. And the climate problem will become more severe in 3 years or so. And so Americans are going to be forced to face a very difficult choice. Do they really want more of that madness, or do they want to do something reasonable and coherent? And I'm guessing that Americans are going to come through and they're going to repudiate the madness of the Trump years, and they're going to choose instead to do the right thing and move towards a sustainable world. I could be wrong, but 2024, I think, is going to be a moment of truth for the United States and maybe for other nations as well.
So William, what if the Americans do perhaps hypothetically do vote in former President Trump?
Then I think the country will have a civil war because the left wing and the right wing are both saying, like 40 or 50% of those two groups talking about seceding, about dividing the country. They hate one another. So that would be the end of the United States. I think we could have a civil war in the United States if Trump were to be reelected, because he would be empowered to do whatever he wants.
Wow, that just made me nervous.
It is.
I cannot imagine.
It is. It's terrifying. It's terrifying. Yeah, it is. It's terrifying. The world hangs in the balance, really. And we need a way to think about this. I do not see a vision out there for where the world is going. And that's what this framework provides, a reasonable vision based upon human values. And the evidence, I think, points to this. I think it's very clear. Richard, please tell me what else you think about this.
Well, I'm really interested in the vaccination and the behaviour that's starting to emerge out of COVID vaccinations. I've observed, particularly here in New Zealand, that we are probably for the first time since the Second World War having to debate between the rights of the individual versus the collective good. And in some ways that's challenging socialism, if you like, on one hand, and a capitalist system on the other. And I wonder whether that spills over into other dimensions of life as well. And it might be that you're seeing some similar things where you are.
Yes, it's a very critical time. That's right. And the rise of autocracy is very terrifying.
Indeed.
So, anyways, we're at that clock. Professor Halal, thank you so much. I look forward to receiving those findings on disinformation and misinformation. Send out that email. But that talk absolutely gives you one alternative framework that would actually help us as futures practitioners to see what are the possible alternatives in terms of even doing our own research work. Thank you so much, Professor Halal.
Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.
Goodbye.